People are being poisoned in ways you would never guess. In August of this year, Erin Mims was celebrating her birthday with her husband at a Houston restaurant, and after returning to her car, she noticed a napkin on the door handle. When Erin saw the napkin, she thought that her husband was playing a prank on her. She didn't really think much of it, so she grabbed the napkin and threw it out and asked her husband if he had put the napkin on the door handle, and he said no. That's when Erin went back into the restaurant to wash her hands. Shortly after returning to the car, Erin began to feel a tingling sensation on her fingers, and after 5 minutes, her whole arm began to feel numb. Erin says she was having trouble breathing, she got hot flashes, and her heart began to beat really fast. Erin was quickly taken to the hospital, and after doing some tests, they told her that her vitals were all over the place. The doctor told her that it was an acute poisoning from an unknown substance, and the napkin situation may have been an attempted kidnapping.
This kid fucking jumped off! Oh, bye-bye! Oh, shit! That's it! The buoy!
This is Cameron Robbins, and this was very well the last time that anyone would see him. Cameron Robbins was a student at the University Laboratory School in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He would be going on a trip with a group of students when he apparently would be dared to jump overboard. And Cameron unfortunately would agree to do this. This dare would take place in the dead of night, so when Cameron jumped overboard and he was swimming in the ocean, he would be out in the pitch black. According to the Royal Bahamas Police Force, this would take place last Wednesday at 9:40 p.m. The Royal Bahamas Police Force would also give a statement stating that the boy willingly jumped off of the ship himself. Robbins had recently graduated from high school, but unfortunately, this story does not have a happy ending. The Coast Guard has officially called off the search for Cameron Robbins. This one dare, this one lapse in judgment, this one jump most likely costed this young man his life. It's a very dark story, and it actually reminds me of another story involving a young man.
This is the reason why you stay away from haunted houses. A Japanese paranormal investigator by the name Gashan explored a house that locals feared and called it Ju-on's house. As Gashan explores the house, he hears footsteps upstairs. Worried homeless people might be up there, he attempts to reason with them by letting them know he'll leave if they're up there. He doesn't get a response back, so he carefully explores the upstairs rooms and makes a horrifying discovery. He finds Buddha's altars in the first room, and in the second room, he finds an old knife which disturbs him. Shortly after entering that room, he hears a bell somewhere in the house. As he explores the house for 30 more minutes, he can't find the source of the sound, so he finally decides to make his way out. And when he goes downstairs, this happens. He unknowingly records what looks like someone's legs swinging above the stairs he just went through. He didn't even realize it until looking at the video.
If you're thinking about ignoring your gut instinct, don't. Here are 3 reasons why you should trust it. Reddit user Pagerama said that she was at a festival with her friends, and one of them really wanted to go on this giant drop-style carnival ride. Pagerama said that at this particular time, she just really didn't feel good about going on the ride, and suggested that they do something else instead. Later that day, they found out that a girl had died on the ride, just a few hours after they were there. Apparently, she wasn't harnessed in properly, and she fell out as the ride dropped. A Reddit user we'll call Jessica said that she was walking back from her grandmother's house when a car pulled up beside her. As she kept walking, the car slowly followed. When she looked into the car, there was a man in his 30s or 40s who had the evilest grin on his face. She said that his face has still never left her mind. As he was slowly coming toward her, his eyes stayed on her. She screamed out for help and ran until she found someone that let her into their house. The man didn't leave until they called the police. When they came, they searched his car and found handcuffs, a blindfold, and a big container with 2 holes poked in the top. Her instincts saved her from being kidnapped. Anonymous said that after a party many years ago, he was driving home at like 4 in the morning with his friend who was passed out in the passenger seat. He was driving fast down a steep hill that's like half a mile long. He was on autopilot as he drove down that street every day. Suddenly, about half a block from a major intersection, which he had a green light for, he heard a voice in his head. It said these exact words: "You may want to slow down, because if you don't, you might lose your life. He said that it was weird because that's not really what his tone of voice sounds like. Anyway, he slowed down as he was entering the intersection, and a car blew the red light at about 60 miles per hour right in front of him. He said that it was so close that he nearly threw up. He started shaking and yelling at his friend about how he had just saved their lives. His friend just groaned and went back to sleep.
After 25 years, genetic investigators are saying that the DNA evidence in the JonBenet Ramsey murder case could be identified in a matter of hours. If you don't already know, in December of 1996, JonBenet was just 6 years old and had already won multiple titles in beauty pageants across the country. On the 26th, her family planned to fly to Michigan for a post-Christmas vacation, but everything changed when her mom, Patsy, walked downstairs to find a ransom note on their back staircase. In short, the perpetrator claimed that JonBenet was unharmed and demanded $180,000 for her safe return. Right away, Patsy ran upstairs to find her daughter missing, and police were at the scene by 6 a.m. Authorities' initial search of the house reportedly turned up nothing, but later that afternoon, JonBenet's father looked for himself to find a broken basement window and his daughter's body lying in their family wine cellar. He carried her upstairs screaming, likely destroying much of the evidence that was left on her body. JonBenet was found completely bound with tape covering her mouth, and an autopsy would report that she suffered a skull injury 45 minutes to 2 hours before dying of strangulation. Unsurprisingly, her parents and stepbrother were under suspicion in the following months, but with no real evidence against them or any other leads, the case eventually grew cold. We can get into a lot with this, but in the end, police have said it's incredibly improbable that a stranger would break into this mansion, find JonBenet's bedroom on the 3rd floor, silently remove her from her bed, and then assault her in the basement for 2 hours before taking the time to write a 3-page ransom note that makes no sense. I'll get into all the theories in my next post, but regardless, JonBenet's murder remains unsolved, and authorities are sitting on unidentified DNA evidence that was recovered from her body. Chief genetic genealogists are saying their new technology could identify this DNA within hours, and as we speak, the Ramseys are fighting for police to hand over the samples so that the testing can be done.
There's a theory going around, and it's growing more and more steam, so I think we have to discuss it. The theory is the murder of Madison, Xana, Kaylee, and Ethan could have been the work of a Northwest serial killer. We now have 3 unsolved, gruesome, and seemingly random stabbing attacks in the Northwest over the past 3 years. And you won't believe the similarities between the 3 cases. Let's start with Sandra Ladd. Sandra went to bed on June 13th, 2020, and was not heard from again until she was found deceased the following day on the 14th. She was found in her bed with multiple stab wounds and no clues left behind. All the police know is most likely during the late hours of the 13th, someone got into her home and murdered her in her sleep. This case has obviously never been solved. Now let's fast forward to August the 13th of 2021, where Travis and Jamie Lynn were sound asleep in their home when around 3 a.m. an intruder got into their home and into their bedroom and began stabbing them while they slept. This was obviously another very bloody and gruesome attack, and it would take Travis's life. However, miraculously, his wife survived despite being stabbed 19 times. This attack took place in Oregon, about an hour and a half from where Sandra was murdered the year prior. So now we have 2 very gruesome stabbing attacks, both occurring on the 13th day of a month, about a year apart from each other, and both occurring in the middle of the night. So that leads us to the year 2022, to the next bordering state, which is Idaho. And this is a map showing the route between each crime scene. So we started in Washington, have dropped down to Oregon, and now have obviously moved over to Idaho. And again, almost a year from the previous attack, on the 13th, in the middle of the night, a very gruesome murder would take place again. So we now have a seemingly random, sadistic stabbing attack on June 13th of 2020, August 13th of 2021, and now November 13th of 2022. And here we are again, a month out from this attack, and again with no suspect.
This is the reason why you stay away from haunted houses. A Japanese paranormal investigator by the name Gashan explored a house that locals feared and called it Juwon's house. As Gashan explores the house, he hears footsteps upstairs. Worried homeless people might be up there, he attempts to reason with them by letting them know he'll leave if they're up there. He doesn't get a response back, so he carefully explores the upstairs rooms and makes a horrifying discovery. He finds Buddha's altars in the first room, and in the second room, he finds an old knife which disturbs him. Shortly after entering that room, he hears a bell somewhere in the house. As he explores the house for 30 more minutes, he can't find the source of the sound, so he finally decides to make his way out. And when he goes downstairs, this happens. He unknowingly records what looks like someone's legs swinging above the stairs he just went through. He didn't even realize it until looking at the video.
How many of you guys remember this girl? She went absolutely viral in 2020 for making faces in court. But before we get into her story, my name is Ashley, and if you guys like crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories, check out my YouTube channel or my TikTok for more content. So this girl's name is Isabella Guzman, and in 2013, she fatally stabbed her mother over 79 times. The video that went viral was actually from 2013, but somehow it took 7-8 years for it to reach mass audience. So initially, Isabella was quite young when she started exhibiting a lot of behavioral issues. She was living with her mother at the time, but when she was 7 years old, she was sent to live with her father. After a few years went by, her father then sent her to go live with her mother again when she was a teenager. And in August of 2013, the relationship between Isabella and her mother quickly deteriorated. They were fighting quite often, and on August 27th, they had an argument that ended with Isabella spitting in her mother's face. The following morning, Isabella's mother received an email saying, "You will pay." Obviously, she was terrified and didn't know what else to do with her daughter, so she called the police. The police arrived to her home and then talked to Isabella, telling her that if she didn't straighten up, that her mother could legally kick her out of the house. Isabella's mother then called her biological father to come talk to Isabella. He came over to their house and had a long talk with her in the backyard, talking to her about respect. According to him, he thought that they had made a lot of progress, but then a few hours later, everything changed. August 28, 2013, around 9:30 p.m., Isabella's mother, Yeonmi Hoi, arrived home. She told her husband she was going to head upstairs and take a shower. That's when her husband hears these awful screams coming from upstairs. Obviously, he runs upstairs to see what's wrong, and when he gets to the bathroom, he sees Isabella slamming the bathroom door shut, locking herself and her mother in the bathroom. He tried as hard as he could to get that door open, but it was locked. All he heard was screaming and an obvious struggle going on. Then he saw blood seeping through the bottom of the door and called 911. Then, as the door was opening, he heard his wife say the word Jehovah, and then Isabella walked out of the bathroom with a bloody knife. Apparently, Isabella didn't say a single thing, just stared at him and walked away like nothing had happened. He runs into the bathroom to check on his wife when he discovers that she had been brutally stabbed 79 times. Unfortunately, she passed away. By the time police arrived, Isabella had run away from the home, but police quickly found her the following day, hiding in a nearby parking garage. On September 5, 2013, Isabella was brought into court for the first time, and that's where we see the video of her making all these faces. We'd later find out that Isabella was actually suffering from schizophrenia and had delusions for years. According to her, she didn't remember that she was stabbing her mother. She thought that she was stabbing a woman named Cecilia in order to save the world. The judge accepted her plea of mental insanity and sentenced her to a mental facility. In June 2021, Isabella was given permission to leave the hospital for her therapy sessions. She has expressed remorse for what happened, but also said that her mother was extremely abusive towards her.
Have you ever heard of Joan Robinson Hill? And I am going to warn you, this is going to be 2 parts, so if you don't like part 2s, keep scrolling. Joan was the adopted daughter of a Houston oil millionaire. His name was Ash Robinson. Being the daughter of a millionaire, Joan lived a very nice life, but she especially loved horses, and she was an excellent horsewoman. One reporter even described watching her ride, and he said that his goose bumps got goose pimples. But not only was Joan the daughter of a millionaire, she also married a millionaire. She married John Hill, and he was one of the top plastic surgeons in their area. And yeah, she just lived a very, very nice life. But in 1969, Jo fell ill. There was something wrong with her, and doctors couldn't quite put their finger on it. March 19th of 1969, Joan was in the hospital. She was being treated for low blood pressure, infection, and uncontrollable bowel movements. But the hospital that she was in wasn't the greatest, which was very strange considering that she was married to a millionaire, so wouldn't she have been at one of the top-of-the-line hospitals? But around 1:30 that morning, she sat up and threw up a large amount of blood and then passed away. At this point, Joan and John had been married for 12 years, and when Joan passed away, John came into the room and was acting very typical for someone who had just lost his wife. But doctors were never able to quite find out what had killed Joan. There was no real cause for her death. And Joan was embalmed before a real autopsy could be performed. But while John was acting very grief-stricken that his wife had just passed, in the first week of June, just a couple of weeks later, he married a woman named Anne Kurth. This was very weird considering he had just lost his wife and now he was getting remarried again. And it was because of his new marriage so soon after Joan had died that Ash decided he wanted to dig deeper. Ash demanded that Joan's body be exhumed so that they could do further investigation. Ash was 100% convinced that somehow John had poisoned Joan in order to marry his new girlfriend. Looking further into Joan's death, Ash was able to find out about a dinner party the couple had had where John was giving out certain desserts. He insisted that Joan take an eclair and refused to let her trade it for something else that she wanted. Friends also started talking about how John and Joan's relationship wasn't the greatest, and they often argued a lot. John said Joan spent too much time with her horses, and Joan said John spent too much time with other women. Part 2 is up.
Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself. At least that's what a lot of people think. And here's some of the evidence that they cite when they talk about this case. So after his initial arrest, Jeffrey Epstein was placed on suicide watch for a number of reasons, even though he was continuously telling prison psychologists, friends, attorneys that he wouldn't do that and he's never considered it. So first of all, let's take a look at this sign. This is a sign that was hanging on or around Jeffrey Epstein's jail cell. No one knows why this question mark is around the mandatory. A newspaper even reached out to the Bureau of Prisons to ask about why there was an underlining question mark here, but they refused to comment. 7:49 on the night before they found Epstein dead in his cell. He's led to his cell and he's placed there. So Epstein had been on suicide watch for weeks at this point, but he had just been taken off suicide watch the day before. The people running the prison, the Bureau of Prison System, they recommended that Jeffrey Epstein needed to have a roommate at all times. Even if he had been taken off of the list, he was still on the list, if you know what I mean. Well, for some reason that night his roommate was not assigned to him, they were removed from the cell, and that left Jeffrey Epstein completely alone in his jail cell. Now remember this sign that said that they have to search his cell and look at Jeffrey Epstein every 30 minutes? Well, that did not happen. Well, it turns out that the two security guards that were supposed to check on him every 30 minutes, Michael Thomas and Tova Noel, did not check on him for over 8 hours. Video surveillance footage literally shows them playing with their phones and sleeping on the job. And keep in mind that Epstein at this point was America's most high-profile criminal. This dude was all over the news. And after all this, these two were charged with falsifying documents and attempting to defraud the federal government. So something that's always kind of rubbed me the wrong way about all this is the security camera footage itself. Now, this is a prison. Every angle should have been being captured at every single moment. You know, anything can happen in prison. And video footage of the security guards exists from that night, but there is no video footage of Epstein's cell block area or his cell door. It's actually been reported that the camera that was shooting the angle down Jeffrey Epstein's cell block area corrupted the night that he took his own life. Of all times for this one specific camera to corrupt and the footage to be lost, it was that night when it happened. And there's a lot more that we're going to get into, but like I said, there's just a lot here that we're going to cover, but This quote really says a lot about what I just told you. So Epstein's taken off suicide watch the day before he kills himself. His roommate is removed from the cell. The cameras on his tier are not working. The guards fell asleep. It seems almost impossible to think all those things could happen in that way. And this is Epstein we're talking about, America's most high-profile prisoner. In fact, the suicide watch observation log, this is the actual document, shows that Epstein was acting pretty normally that day. Which isn't to say that he wasn't deceiving people by saying he didn't want to take his own life when he was secretly trying to get alone time where he could do it, but it's still an interesting side note. In the next TikTok, we're going to get into the really crazy stuff.
On April 23, 2006, a Texas man named Gary Brown was on his way to the Takugama Chimp Sanctuary in Sierra Leone, Africa for a day of sightseeing. With him were 2 American colleagues and 2 local men named Isa and Melvin. As the 5 drove along, all of a sudden this huge chimp came running out of the jungle, stopping in the road, just stopping the vehicle in its tracks. The driver, Isa, who was one of the locals, knew this chimp was not acting right, so he began to back away from it. But this 6-foot-tall, 270-pound alpha male chimp named Bruno was not having it. Bruno got down on all fours and just tore off after the vehicle. When he gets to the vehicle, he's screaming, he's pounding on it, he grabs one of the side mirrors, rips it off, throws it, runs to the back window, punches it out, and then leaps through the window into the back of the car, where he immediately begins to maul Melvin, who's sitting in between the 2 Americans, Gary and the other guy. This crazy fight breaks out where this chimp grabs Melvin's hand and bites off more than half of it. 3 fingers and most of his hand are gone. Somehow the men get this chimp back out the window, but Melvin's bleeding profusely, so Gary takes off his shirt. He uses it to try and staunch the flow of blood, and meanwhile, Isa, he takes off forwards again down the road, trying to get away from this chimp, which is pursuing them. Eventually, they come to a locked gate. It's locked with a chain, and Isa attempts to ram through it. It works in so much as the gate opens, but it stalls the vehicle, so the men all bail out. Isa, he just goes tearing off down the road towards the jungle, looking for help. The 2 Americans who are not Gary, they get out and they run a little ways away, but they hold back waiting for Gary and Melvin. Meanwhile, this chimp runs up on top of the car, grabs Melvin out, rips him out, and begins mauling him again. By the time Gary gets out of the car, all he can hear is Melvin screaming, "Oh God, please, please help me." And now Gary is ticked. He looks down, he sees the biggest stick that he can find, he grabs it, he runs around the vehicle just in time to see this chimp finishing basically tearing off and eating one of Melvin's feet. There's just tendons hanging out. So Gary, he just goes charging up to this chimp. The chimp turns around, kind of bows up on him, but Gary uses this stick as a lance and rams it into Bruno the chimp's throat as hard as he can. And this drives Bruno on his back, and then Bruno takes off into the jungle. So Gary, he helps Melvin up, and they begin hobbling down the road. The 2 Americans and Melvin and Gary would eventually make it to the main road. Melvin and Gary would be picked up by a military truck and taken to the hospital, where Melvin would make it just fine. But once they got there, shortly after, Gary was in the parking lot when a van pulled up. And when they opened up the back of that van, there in the back were the remains of Isa. He had run into the rest of this troop of chimps, which had escaped earlier that day, and they had mauled him to death, taking off his jaw, disemboweling him, taking both of his hands and feet, and taking off his genitals.
A man was in a cemetery in Serbia when all of a sudden he started hearing strange sounds coming from inside a grave, and this is what he captured on camera. Check this out.
Gospode Bože, kakvi su ovo zvuci? Je li realno ovo? Kuku, gospode, ovo je horor. Horor, trauma, brate mili, trauma.
That same week, he went home, and while refurbishing his home, he found a very strange object.
Ovako nešto potrefi.
Is what he found.
Nije slučajno. Koliko je rekao od vrata? 1,20 m ispred ulaznih vrata od kuće. Vidi da nije ništa slučajno. Što ima ona tkanina crna. To su idioti stavili unutra. Neki papirić.
He found a piece of paper, some hair, and while doing all of this, he felt this was some sort of
black magic or some sort of curse. This is what he found. Check this out. Really creepy. Now.
Malo mi je gadno što diram. Evo. I kako je moguće da čovjek potrefi? Evo.
So I get asked this question all the time. What is the scariest book that you have in your collection, or scariest books? And so I put together a list of 5. And the Egyptian Book of the Dead doesn't even make the list. What books do make the list? Here goes. This book is from 1589. It is a book on demonology, written by none other than James I, or King James, the man who would have the Bible printed that carries his name. He wrote a book on demonology and witchcraft in 1589. Next is the most sinister book ever written on witchcraft and demonology, Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of the Witches. This book is responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of people who were accused of witchcraft. It is a 1,000-page witch hunting guide. This was used from about 1500, printed in 1486, from about 1500 to 1750, including the Salem witch trials. Here is the first English edition of Malleus Maleficarum. Okay, next, a very small book, but it is called True Black Magic, or The Secret of Secrets, and this purports to be from a manuscript found in the Sepulchre of Solomon. The original book on occult philosophy was printed in 1533 by Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, and this is a first edition of that book. All other books on occult philosophy reference this book. 500 years ago that was printed. And finally, the last item isn't really a book, although it does include a book. It includes a Bible. But this is the contents that came from Charles Manson's prison cell. Now, some of these other books give off a creepy vibe, but just wait. I mean, that's a letter of Squeaky, or a photo of Squeaky Fromm. This is a Bible given to him by one of his members, and he has little clippings from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. There are letters, and I've read these letters from his followers. You can't unread those. And you say, well, how do you know that came from his prison cell? Well, there's his hall pass, his prison pass, inmate Manson. But the most bizarre, the craziest thing are his notes in his own hand, where he tells the story of why he is, or why he is who he was. That, again, you can't unread. And with all the scary books, nothing gives me the creeps as much as the contents of Charles Manson's prison cell.